Felicity. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. We might move into the afternoon session. I'll just invite everybody to come back to their seats. Okay, thanks everybody. Just close the doors. Okay. Thank you everybody and welcome back for the afternoon session. Welcome also to people who are joining us, continuing to join us from rural and regional Victoria. So it's been great to have you as part of this forum and contributing so actively as you have with your questions. So thanks for that. We're going to move into a session that now deals with post-incident responses. So this morning we've heard a lot of really helpful presentations around Department of Health and Human Services and WorkSafe initiatives, and also about what health services are doing to design their interventions. And now we're going to hear from some expert presenters on post-incident responses. So our first presenter on post-incident responses is Felicity Sims, and Felicity is from WorkSafe Victoria. Her position is Program Officer in the Health Practice Hazardous Industries and Industry Practice. Quite a title. So Felicity is going to talk to us about improving investigations of occupational violence and aggression incidents. Thanks, Felicity.
Thanks, Heather. I have been lucky enough to score the straight after lunch session, which I don't know what I've done to deserve this, but I'll do my best. if anyone feels like they had too many carbs at lunch and they need to stand up so they don't fall asleep, I won't be offended at all, I promise. Just stand up and move to the side so you don't block people's views. And I will try to keep it lively. All right, as many of you would know, WorkSafe provides a range of tools and guidance to support employers to meet their obligations under legislation. And this afternoon, what I wanted to do is share with you about one additional resource that we're developing at the moment. And it is focused on incident investigation, and specifically when there's an OVA incident in a health service. Why are we focusing on incident investigation? The Auditor General called it out, the department's called it out, our inspectors see it every day when they're out in your workplaces, the ANMF's called it out. It's not a strong point in our sector. We're great at doing investigations about clinical incidents when things don't go as we plan on the clinical side, but when it comes to health and safety, we don't do as well, and particularly when it's occupational violence and aggression, there's really a lot of room for improvement. But it's okay. By doing better investigations, we can help to prevent future incidents. When incidents happen, there's something that we can learn, and we don't want to let that opportunity go by. Particularly our inspectors, they feel so frustrated sometimes. They see a really nasty incident that's happened, and actually there was a previous incident and an incident before that and one before that, but not enough has been done to learn from that to make sure that something hasn't been, to make sure that it won't recur. So what are we doing? It's a pilot project. We've got 3 steps here. One is develop a tool to help unit managers to do a better OVA incident investigation. Then we're piloting it in some hospital wards to see what the impact is. And then we want to develop that into WorkSafe guidance. WorkSafe puts out guidance all the time, but we said, all right, this time we want to test it. Rather than just show it to people and say, well, you know, what do you think? Do you think it'll work? We want to get people to use it and then tell us what they think so that we can refine it and make it as user-friendly and as effective as possible before we produce it as guidance and say, hey, guys, everyone should look at doing it this way. It's a tool to assist unit managers who we know are busy people to better identify some of those contributing factors to an OVA incident, to better identify actions that can reduce the likelihood of a recurrence, and then some prompts around communication as well. Because we know that so often our staff report incidents and then they don't hear anything. And maybe it was investigated and maybe it wasn't, and maybe something was put in place to change that. But if you don't know, then that doesn't really get you very excited about reporting again next time. So, why a tool? Go here. There we go, that's what we're doing. All right, we'll skip through. Sorry, the image hasn't come up. I had a beautiful picture of the tool there. We've tried really, really hard to make it quick and simple to use, because so much of the feedback that we get is, we don't have time. There is so much paperwork. There is so much to do. We're really understaffed. We don't have time to do a good investigation. We don't need more paper. So we've tried really, really hard. There's a lot of check boxes. So rather than asking people to write out a lot of stuff, consider which ones of these apply to you. And a lot of prompt questions with just a yes or a no to get someone thinking about whether something has or hasn't been done, was or wasn't a factor. They can yes, no, and then move on. It's 1 page, double-sided. This is not ever going to be a gold star incident investigation when it's 1 page, double-sided. But we know that at the moment, we have so far to improve, and if we can move everyone up to doing things a star that's not gold, that's fantastic. We'll put the trimmings on later, right? But we want everyone to say, yep, I can do a better incident investigation and it's going to lead to better outcomes on my ward for safety for everybody. So, oh, there it is, sorry. In the first step, when we developed the tool, I I didn't just make it up. I'm not that smart. We spoke with a lot of people. We spoke with nurses, with unit managers, with assistant unit managers. We spoke with OHS managers. We spoke to people in metro areas, in regional areas. And we spoke to people outside of healthcare, because incident investigation happens across all industries, and some industries are really great at doing this stuff. So we said, all right, let's look at what happens in other sectors. We consulted with the ANMF, we consulted with our WorkSafe inspectors who see this all the time, and experts in OVA and in incident investigation. We've had 1 million drafts, and I know quite a few people in this room have seen quite a few drafts of this tool, and we just kept coming back going, is it better yet? Is this going to be okay? Do you think this will work? And we've come up with a version that we think is pretty good. What it tries to do is prompt a unit manager to go through this process. Obviously, first, your first priority is looking at well-being and making sure that everyone is safe right now. But then trying to understand the details of the event and what were the contributing factors. We don't want to say that the reason that there was an OVA incident was because someone was upset. In terms of prevention, that's really not helpful. It doesn't get us very far to prevent that from happening again. So we want to come back a few steps and say, well, why were they upset? And what were the other things that could have contributed? What are the environmental factors that might have contributed in this incident? What are the staffing factors that might have contributed? What are the patient care factors that might have, and go through all of these sorts of factors so that we can get a better understanding of what we're dealing with. Because then, this unit manager is in a much better position to say, all right, well, what are the existing measures that we have that should have prevented this from happening? We already have training. Why didn't that? We already have a duress alarm. Why didn't that? That's, for all the OHS people in the room, that's your review and revision of risk control measures. And then, importantly, what can we do better to make sure we don't have a similar incident again? What's missing from this picture? Do we need to improve some of those controls we already have, or do we need to add extra ones? Like Will said this morning, looking at what's there already that maybe could be improved, and then what additional things might we need? But these last two steps here, I think these are super important, and we only get to that, well, what do we need to do stage, and then it kind of drops off the radar. It stops being the top priority. People who have responsibility for implementing these measures need to be aware of that. It needs to be assigned to someone, and it needs to go on their to-do list, and it needs to be followed up. Did it actually get done? And then we need to communicate the findings of this incident investigation with all of the relevant people. And that might be, in some cases, that might be a lot of people. There might be really good systems and processes to be able to do that already, or we might need to look at how that works in our organisations. But really, this process, it shouldn't sound like something that new for clinicians, because it's not that different to the process that you would go through for a clinical incident. It's not a really crazy out there kind of thing. It's not new. It's a really standard kind of process. But we're hoping that with this tool, we can prompt people through it. And being OVA specific, when we have some of those OVA specific contributing factors with the checkboxes next to them, it can really help people. What do we hope to see? What do we really hope that the benefits are from using this kind of tool? We hope that we get more effective incident investigations so that we're able to say, all right, this happened. We've been able to put something in place to prevent that from happening again. We also hope that there's increased awareness of OVA on a unit or a ward that's where the unit managers are using this kind of tool. And that increased belief amongst staff that OVA is not acceptable and that there are things that can be done to better prevent and manage it. And this links back to the campaign. It's about attitudes and that attitude that, yeah, I will report it because something can happen. If I report it, it'll be investigated and then something will change and then we'll have a safer ward. This is what we hope, right? This is the goal. Okay. And it's important to note that this is a prompt tool. It's to guide people through that investigation process. It's not a system. It doesn't change the way that you report. It's to help someone to go through that process. There it is again. So step 2, pilot the tool. So we've trialled it, we've just finished trialling it for 4 months in 9 acute wards at Frankston, Knox Private and the Royal Women's. And I know there's people from all 3 hospitals who've been involved in that here today, so a big thank you to you, because we can't pilot it if no one puts their hand up. Our research partners have been collecting feedback from participating unit managers and OHS teams, as well as the nurses on those wards. And they're currently evaluating the feedback and preparing recommendations for us and saying, okay, you developed this prompt tool. This is how it went when you put it into health services. So how should you now adjust it to make it the best version it can be to release statewide as guidance? What happened during the pilot? So nurses in the pilot wards completed surveys before we started using the tool and then after. What we really wanted to try and find out was whether their attitudes towards OVA changed, whether having their unit managers use this tool to go through this process changed the way that they saw OVA and changed their intention to report. Unfortunately, we had low response rates to the surveys, and I suspect there's a lot of people in the room who can believe that. There was a fair bit of survey fatigue going on. It's disappointing because it makes it hard for us to draw really firm conclusions about safety culture in those wards and attitudes in those wards that can change, hopefully, when the tool is being used. But we haven't received the final report yet, but the early indications that attitudes towards OVA that came out of those surveys were fairly consistent with other research that's been done in this space. So there was nothing sort of outrageous going on there. It's fairly consistent. After the pre-surveys were done, unit managers attended a briefing session about the tool. We said, this is the project, this is what the tool looks like, this is how we'd like you to use it, any questions? And they were encouraged to use the tool. So over the 4-month period, we said, whenever there's an OVA incident on your ward, when you do your investigation, use this tool to help you. And then at the end of the pilot period, they participated in an interview to talk about their experience using the tool. What was it like? Did you find it useful? How would you improve it if you had the chance? Because these are the people that we want to use it at the end of the day, right? We want to make sure it works for them. So I've put in some quotes here from some of the unit managers and OHS people. There's a great one there about culture changing on the ward, staff being more, reporting more OVA incidents and being more aware of the incident investigation process. And I think that's a really exciting outcome. If you can introduce this kind of tool and it can lead to that kind of change on a ward, then I think that's really powerful. Comments about using the tool helps you to focus on not the behaviour that happened, but what were the reasons behind it, what led to it. Good prompts and giving different levels, whatever level of management you are, something to think about, well, what do we need to do? What can we do? So for me, those sorts of quotes are really exciting. Some of the barriers that came out of those interviews, and again, I don't think this will be news to many people in the room, but things like, it's a time thing. It's a time factor. We just don't have time to do it. It's just the staff don't report the incidents. And yeah, if you're not aware of an incident, it's very difficult to investigate it. I get that. And this is, again, one of the links back to the campaign. One of the strong message for staff for that campaign is you need to report these incidents so something can be done. But we know that from the research, that people won't report if they don't believe that anything will change, that anything it's worth their while, which I think is fair enough. So that's something we're really trying to change here, and it's a bit of a vicious cycle. But if we can get people to see results and change when they do report, then that should help to build that momentum. And some comments about needing training on how to do a really good investigation. And so that's, I think, a great suggestion for us around implementation and saying, all right, if we have a template for a really great tool, how do we implement it in our health service? How do we make sure that people understand how to use it and can use it in their daily work? Some suggestions for how to improve it. It's a space issue. You know, you need more room to be able to write more stuff. On the other hand, the more streamlined you can make it, the better. So you can't please everybody. But yeah, we recognise it does need to be really simple and quick and easy to use. And wanting to see the tool incorporated into the broader reporting system rather than sitting outside of it. And that's definitely a theme that's come through right from when we first flagged this project at the beginning, and something that we're talking with the department about. So what now? Oh, sorry, I should have put those on the screen. We're working with our research partners to measure the tool's impact, make some improvements, and then release the tool as WorkSafe guidance. So we don't have that final report from our research partners yet. Once we do, it'll be easier for us to see the scope of work that needs to follow before we can publish that tool, and perhaps some case studies around it or some suggestions on implementation or something like that. But it would probably be early next year. Longer term, what do we want to see? Increased reporting of OVA incidents is, you know, I think what everyone wants to see, and hopefully this tool can really support that, because again, if you see a change from when you report something, you're more inclined to report again. Decreasing severity of OVA incidents and decreasing number of OVA incidents. It's a long-term outlook, but really taking that sort of prevention lens to incident investigation, and rather than seeing this as something extra to do, seeing it as an opportunity to prevent something from happening again. So I guess with incident investigation, what we hope is the tool can lead to a better investigation, which leads to better prevention and management and a safer ward environment. And I think something that was touched on this morning, this is a less stressful environment for staff and for patients and visitors. I think this is all stuff that we covered this morning. And finally, I just wanted to note that, you know, this is a project entirely focused on incident investigation. It's not the only thing that WorkSafe is doing in this space. We have inspectors out visiting health services, looking at what's happened after an incident. What's happened after an OVA incident? What was your review of risk control like? What was your incident investigation like? What have you done to prevent a similar incident from happening again? And also our guidance. Patrice mentioned this morning that that's been refreshed. The section on incident investigation has been updated and broadened. And then hopefully, once this tool is developed, it can be either incorporated into that or referred to in that. And as I've said, obviously all of this also links to the campaign and that reporting aspect. We've said to staff, you need to report, but one of the key messages for employers in the campaign materials is you need to encourage staff to report, and you need to do really solid incident investigations, because those two things go hand in hand. You need both. All right, I think questions are at the end. So.
Thank you, Felicity, and we can take some questions on that presentation at the end of this session of 3 presentations. And just a reminder to the regional and rural people that you're welcome to submit any questions you'd like to via the email. We're going to move on to hear from Anne-Laure Quano. She's nodding approvingly there. On how to support staff following violence. She's from a group called Phoenix Australia, which I think from recollection is a Melbourne University group, and she's a psychologist by training, and she's going to talk, as I said, about best practice support to staff following violence. So please welcome her to talk on that topic. Thanks, Anne-Laure.
Hi everyone. So this is going to be a bit of a change of pace. It's really looking at providing psychological support following violence. I've got a very thick accent, so hopefully you'll get used to it. Within 2 minutes, people forget I've got an accent, but it takes a bit of time. I'm going to provide you with a bit of an overview about the impacts that violence can have on people psychologically, but primarily I'm going to talk about the kind of support that really helps people recover in those early days after an incident. So I'll just push that. So I should have checked that before I started. So in terms of violence, and I'm not going to give you a definition of violence, I'm sure you've had lots and lots of them over the few hours that you've been here. But what I want to talk about here is that when you look at the spectrum of violence that are experienced in a workplace, particularly when you're working in the health sector, is that often people tend to think about, the impact of violence when they think about the most severe end of the spectrum of violence. So they think about sexual, physical assault, and then often people feel like people need to intervene at that point in time, that it's really important to support that people at that point. But what we find in the research is, particularly in the work environment, is that verbal assaults, psychological violence, is equally, if not more, impactful in terms of long-term effect of violence. And that's something that really needs to be addressed when you support people after violence. The other thing to think about is that in the health sector, particularly, what you see is cumulative violence. So people that work over many years and experience violence over time. And what we find is that the more incidents you experience, the more likely you are to go on to develop psychological problems in the long term. So that those people that experience violence time and time again, how to best support those people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The other thing that often is important to think about is people that witness other people getting assaulted or getting experiencing violence, that often they can be just as impacted as a person being attacked themselves. Just to put it in context, and this is what's been said, I think, all day, so I'm just not going to spend much time on this, but when we think about best practice in supporting people following violence, that's very dependent on people actually reporting the violence. And we know that violence is very common in the health sector, and in certain sectors more so, like mental health and emergency sector, etc. But that, as people have been saying, it's vastly underreported. And so when I'm going to talk about best practice in terms of supporting people, that has to be in the context of improving reporting. If not, you end up with a system where only a few people really access effective help and support. So I think all the things we've talked about today around prevention, it also is very important in ensuring that people actually get the support they need after an incident. I just want to talk about, when I'm going to talk about the impacts of violence, I'm going to talk about immediate kind of impacts, what happens to someone when they first experience violence, but also I'll talk about the longer term impacts. Oops, didn't realize I had a bell there. You don't want to be talking with your hands. When you're French, that's a bit hard. So I'm going to talk about the immediate impact and the longer term impacts. What we know is that immediately following violence, so that might be the first day, the first few weeks after violence, people have a range of responses that happens to them. The most common ones are physiological responses. So for most people that experience violence, their body responds when it's faced with danger, and people get very tense, very alert, and the body gets flooded often with adrenaline and other chemicals, and people get very, very hyper alert, very tense. And that's fairly common, and that may affect people's sleep often, mood. So often you find people at work being slightly more irritable. It affects concentration. So you can have changes like that that are quite common and often ease over time for people after an incident. There's other things that happen that are fairly common after an incident, particularly if it's particularly violent, and that's things that having memories intruding in a person's mind day to day, having nightmares about what happened, not being able to be around places or people that remind them of the event. So that can be quite common. And again, those problems ease over time for most people, but with some people that stays. What really can be very detrimental to people recovering are behaviors that people use to deal with those types of symptoms. And often what people do is that they will withdraw from work or withdraw from people that they usually rely on because they don't want to think about the trauma, they feel vulnerable. They might use things like drug and alcohol to help themselves go to sleep at night or to deal with the anxiety. And these types of coping mechanisms really hinder recovery for people. And they could become a big problem. And if you want to support people right after an incident, targeting particularly those coping behaviors is incredibly important. The other thing that happens is that because of those coping behaviors, relationships at work and at home can get impacted. And we know that people cope best with trauma by being supported. And the very coping behavior people often use will isolate them. I've mentioned a couple of times that a lot of the things I've just described ease over time. Most people that experience occupational violence will recover over time. So they may get very distressed initially, and within 2 to 3 weeks will get better. And that's for the majority of people. So, and I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer, but if you think about the pink line, most people, their functioning, their ability to function at work, at home, their distress will get worse immediately after the incident. And it's not unusual to have that for 2 to 3 weeks, yeah, and then see people recover. That's often what you see most typically. For some people, however, and for particularly in instances where you're harmed by another human being, so which is really what happens in occupational violence, you've got people that will get distressed, and in that first month, which seems to be very critical in recovery, kind of get stuck in that recovery. They're not able to recover from all those symptoms that I've just described. Yeah. And they persist over time. But often what you see is you see that in the first month, or first month to 6 weeks, and they just don't move on. Yeah. You have slightly fewer people that will look fine. They'll be fine after the incident. They won't have the nightmares, they will sleep well, or they might have some symptoms, but they manage them. They seem to contain them through coping mechanisms. But over time, what happens is, for some of them, those coping mechanisms will stop working. So for example, you might have someone, they just throw themselves into their work, and that's how they cope. But eventually, the stress of having to constantly work to get away from thoughts and feelings will get to them. And all of a sudden, they will look like they have mental health issues. 2 years, 3 years, 10 years down the track. That's not. So you'll have groups like that where their mental health will be affected a long time after the incident has happened. That may be also precipitated by a stressful event or another incident at work. That's of a similar nature, yeah. And you have a few people that don't seem to be affected very much. But again, that's it's more unusual than actually people becoming distressed and then bouncing back. So what is it that in that critical period of 2 weeks to 1 month that puts people more at risk? Because if you're going to look at a good intervention, an effective intervention for people, that's what you need to consider. What we know is that there's a few key risk factors for people going on to develop mental health issues following violence. One, it's the nature of the incident itself. So if you have an incident where you're harmed by someone else, you're much more likely to go on to develop mental health issues that, say, you're involved in a car accident and you get severely injured, or you're involved in a natural disaster. So if another human being harms you, that in itself is a risk factor. The other risk factor is that's by far the biggest risk factor is not being supported by your usual support network, where you're isolated, you don't have social support at the time just following the incident. And again, often that can occur because of work cultures, where maybe violence is minimized, or the or people feel like they're not, this is not a big deal, I don't have to report this, I don't have to ask for help. Or it could be because the very coping mechanisms people use at the time of the incident isolates them. So they withdraw from their work colleagues, they don't speak to them, they withdraw from their family because they're distressed, and then they don't get the support that they need. So that's by far the biggest risk factor. So any effective intervention has to be about helping people stay connected or reconnect with their social networks. By far the most effective. And the other thing that's a risk factor is other stressful incidents and not being able to manage that at the time of recovery. So in that first month, if on top of the violent incident, you're dealing with massive amounts of stress at work, or you're going through a divorce, or there's another violent incident, that in itself really impacts on recovery. So giving tools for people to manage that stress or to decrease the stress of people at that time is also incredibly important. I want to talk about the longer term problems that you can see as a result of workplace violence very briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But what the research has shown is that really following occupational violence in the health sector, you do see quite a reasonable number of people going to develop for up to 12 months moderate to severe mental health issues. They're often around depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder are the most common ones, but also drug and alcohol, especially alcohol abuse, becomes a major problem. Yeah. And also burnout, which is when you feel like you can't engage with work, you feel detached from your work, cynical around your job, those sorts of things. So given what I've just presented, I just want to talk to you about really what needs to underpin really effective support for people that have been through a violent incident. The thing, again, that I said is the most important is that sense of connectedness that you see in that square in the bottom. So having a sense of connections with your colleagues, with your family, with your peers, your friends, is incredibly important, and that needs to be supported. The other thing is that when you go through an incident, like any traumatic incident, but particularly violence, is that it takes your sense of safety away. Your sense of safety at work, your sense of safety in the world. Having an intervention that makes sure that you do feel safe at work, that you feel safe within yourself, that if you begin to feel overwhelmed by feelings of anxiety, you have ways of coping with that, is incredibly important. Giving strategies for people to manage strong emotions is also important, and to keep calm. And that's important because it gives people a sense of control as well over themselves. When you're attacked by someone or you're abused by someone, the first thing it does is that it takes a sense of control away from yourself. And having skills, support that give you a sense that you have choice and control, that you can do something about how you feel, can give you back a sense of control. And that seems to have an impact on recovery as well. Yeah. And of course, it gives you a sense of hope. So in order to do that, there have been a range of programs that have been developed initially in the disaster area, so called psychological first aid, and many of you have probably heard about these set of interventions. Psychological first aid is an evidence-informed approach to providing people with skills that are tailored to their needs. So it's a very flexible approach where you take each person on a one-to-one basis, assess what their needs are, especially in terms of learning how to manage their own emotions, practical supports they may need in order to keep doing the job that they need to do and to stay in their jobs, but also then giving them tools to stay socially connected to people. So it's certainly an approach where it's not one approach fits everybody. It's really about tailoring it to each person that walks through the door. It's very practical, so it's very much about saying, what do you need right now? What skills can we teach you? What help do you need in order to stay in touch with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family? It's something that's delivered, that can be delivered a day, 2 days, a week after an incident, but it's also delivered over time. So this is not a one-off session with a professional. This is having a relationship with someone and providing them with support over time and monitoring their needs as they change over time in that period after an incident. And this is not a specialist approach where you have a psychologist like myself or an EAP provider that's the only person qualified to provide this approach. This is very much something that can be done by a manager, by a peer, by a colleague. And that's really important because often people, that's where they want to go to. They want to go to someone that knows what their work environment is like, what it's like to work in that place, that knows what your day-to-day needs are. And often that's your peer or your manager or someone that's near your workplace. So what PFA is not, as I said, it's not something that requires a mental health professional to help you. It doesn't involve any kind of formal processes in assessing someone's mental health. It's more about having a chat about people's needs and seeing what practically can be done to help them. It doesn't involve treatment. It does involve helping someone figure out which skills they could use to manage their anger, manage their anxiety, but in very, very practical ways. And what it's definitely not is what has been done for a long, long time, which is incident debriefing. So it doesn't involve recounting what happened during an incident, either on a one-to-one basis or on a group basis, and having to tell someone about your feelings about the incident. Now, for some people, they find that really useful, and they can do it, but it's not a necessary part of the process. People are not asked to do that. And there's no pressure for people to talk about what happened to them or their feelings about it. And why that's the case is because there's been a lot of research around critical incident debriefing, and there's lots of different forms of critical incident debriefing. And there hasn't been really evidence to date that it actually promotes better mental health outcomes. So it doesn't seem to really reduce distress long term or to reduce the likelihood particularly of PTSD long term, which is one of the responses. It also, PFA doesn't assume that people are ready to talk about what happened to them and how it's impacting on them right after an incident. In fact, for some people, particularly people that are very distressed by an incident, talking about it right away can actually interfere with their natural recovery process. And sometimes having something that's not tailored, that's very structured, means that people go and don't use what they would naturally use to recover. And that works for them. And you don't want to be doing that. I'm going to quickly because I think I'm out of time. Got 1 more minute? Yeah. So PFA gives you very practical strategies to cope with distress. It gives you a lot of information about what are good coping strategies you could choose to use and bad coping strategies that actually could get in the way of recovery, like drinking, and how to minimize those. It encourages people to connect to others. That's a very, very big part of PFA. But it is, as I said, keeping track of people over time and helping them connect with the help they need if they need to, more formal help. Just to conclude, as I said in the beginning, if people don't report incidents, if there's a culture of not reporting incident, or if people minimize the violence that happened to them or minimize the impact it has had on them, then you can have a great system in place to support people after an incident, and it doesn't work. So what's really important is that when you have a system like that supports people afterwards, that it's embedded in an overall system where you have a strategy around supporting people's mental health in a workplace, you have good reporting systems, you have good referral pathways if people go on to develop problems after an incident. That's it for me.
Thanks, Anne-Laure. That was very interesting. I'm sure there'll be questions about that once we get to the panel session. We're going to come to our final presenter this afternoon, who is Superintendent Mark Porter from Victoria Police. He's the Manager of Deployment. He's been a police officer for almost 40 years, and he's going to talk to us about engaging police with police in reporting an incident, what you need to know. I suspect this will be topic of some conversation because it certainly was in our forum last week with board chairs and CEOs. There was quite a bit of discussion about this. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
It's interesting to see that Victoria Police is right into the same space that Anne-Laure just described with regards to psychological first aid for our own employees. And if you don't know, there's a lot of work going on in the public sector about dealing with occupational violence generally in all public services. So it's great to be invited to a forum such as this to talk about it. My own experience with dealing with occupational violence in other government departments is mostly centred on 3.5 years work in the prison squad. Back in the late 80s, early 1990s, where I was investigating crimes within the Victorian prison system, but that also included Pentridge Hospital and the ward at St Vincent's Hospital, where prisoners are kept as well, which so some of the work involved medical staff as well. So violence, or the threat of violence within a public service scenario, of course, is completely unacceptable. That's the message that's coming out across the sector now. And police are committed to preventing all violence and prosecuting the perpetrators of violence. No surprises there. Dealing with violence is part of our core function. And of course, in dealing with violence, we also suffer a fair degree of occupational violence ourselves. So it's no stranger to us. Police officers are empowered, equipped and trained to deal with all levels of violence. So of course it is our core function. So if something is actually happening and it's still happening when we respond, of course, we're there to deal with it. We are the experts in this space. Police also have a strong victim focus and are often involved in coordinating support for victims of violence in partnership with other agencies. So as an organisation, Victoria Police has worked on creating victim-centric services for a number of years now. And you might say, well, that seems odd because enforcing the law involves, you know, dealing with victims all the time. How come it's just not part of your normal business? And I'll explain that shortly when we talk about the criminal law. How do I move to? Okay, so first of all, let's get on to offending, so criminal offending that is. Occupational violence offences are generally intended crimes against the person that involve threats and or actual physical assault. So intended means really mens rea, the Latin term for guilty mind. It means that a person actually meant to do something. Now there's two levels in crimes against the person on which that can occur. And it's probably best to think of murder and manslaughter when describing this. So a murder means that somebody intended to actually kill another person. A manslaughter means that somebody intended to engage in an act that may have killed somebody and did in fact kill somebody. So it's about being either intentional or reckless in your conduct as an offender. This type of offending, of course, can injure a victim both mentally and or physically. So I think it's probably fair to say you can have mental injury on its own when we receive threats and threatening behaviour. Probably pretty rare to have a physical injury without a mental impact as well. Now, we must all be reasonable in our response to violence and the threat of violence. So we are all entitled to defend ourselves, every member of the public. Section 462A of the Crimes Act in Victoria gives us the power to actually use reasonable force to stop something from occurring. That something has to be the commission, continuation, etc. of an offence. So if somebody goes to assault you, you are entitled to use reasonable force. And the test of reasonableness is the reasonable man test that the courts use. So it's got to be tested as reasonable in all of the circumstances that were known to the person that uses the force. It's common sense, but it can become very technical in a court of law. And rudeness and incivility are not criminal offences. Okay. Okay. Preventing occupational violence. You've probably covered off on a lot of this already today, but for policing, prevention is always better than detection. So the effectiveness of a police service is measured by the absence of crime, not by the number of people arrested for committing crimes. So it is always better to stop something happening. Okay, we can all help to prevent occupational violence within planned activities through thorough risk management. No surprises there. But in your thorough risk management, you need information and data to work with to tell you what is the best way to go about it. So as we just heard from Felicity, you need to have investigations and you need to store the data from investigations in a manner where you can recall it, so you can conduct analysis over time to work out what are we preventing and what is the best way to prevent it. And of course there's just scenarios that aren't planned, so we actually go out and do things that are unplanned, and how do we prevent occupational violence in those circumstances. So this is really bread and butter stuff for police officers. So we actually do it by following procedures, so following our training and maintaining situational awareness and presence of mind. You've got to stay on your game. You've got to watch what's happening, read the situation. And the police can be used as a deterrent if necessary. So that's the same as having a security guard or another deterrent. There are occasions, especially unplanned occasions, where the police may need to be called as a deterrent to prevent something from happening. Nothing surprising. Okay. What if you become a victim and the police become involved? Okay, the criminal law. Police investigate alleged offences and prosecute offenders on behalf of the Crown, not the victim. So it's not like the movies where a victim presses charges. in Australia we use the British criminal system, and we actually enforce the law for the Crown. And we only prosecute somebody when we believe that guilt can be proved beyond reasonable doubt. So there are many occasions where we believe on a balance of probabilities that something happened, but we can't prove that it happened beyond reasonable doubt. So that is a major stumbling block for a lot of prosecutions. So beyond reasonable doubt is the highest level of proof required. In civil law, it's only ever a balance of probabilities. Defendants never have to prove anything until the prosecution has first established a prima facie case, the Latin term for up front, they committed it, now show us that you didn't. And the police must remain objective through the entire process. So that puts us at odds a little bit with being victim focused, because we actually take an oath to enforce the law impartially. So in doing so, obviously we deal with victims who have been very badly treated by an offender or even murdered, and it's hard not to become, as a police officer, not to become emotionally involved with victims and sort of suffer with them to some extent, but we can't. What we do with the offender must be objective, and it must be in accordance with the criminal law. So we can only prosecute when the law allows us to do so. Now that can be very frustrating. So, and I felt this frustration a lot in the time in the prison squad, because quite often an offence would occur. It may have been an assault on another prisoner or a prison officer or staff from the prison, and you have to be able to prove the case against the person beyond reasonable doubt. Now, it's no surprise in a prison scenario, prisoners are very reluctant to become witnesses against other prisoners. So quite often we would have a prison officer telling us one story because they were out on their own, and then the prisoners telling us another story. So who's telling the truth? What can be proven? It can be very frustrating. So, and then you have to deal with the detail in the law. So for an example, I had a trial once where a prison officer was assaulted by a number of prisoners, where the prison officer was one out, and the identification of the main offender was made by the prison officer. He goes to trial, he gets in the witness box, and unsolicited he said, "That's the man that assaulted me, the man sitting over there," which you may see in the movies in American courts of law. Can't do that in Australia without corroboration of the identity. So the corroboration was the fact that the prison officer actually had known the prisoner for many years, but the prosecuting barrister failed to clarify that for the court, closed the case, and the judge said, "You've just been caught out. I'll have to direct the jury to dismiss because you didn't clarify the identification of the offender." These are the sorts of things that go on in criminal courts, and it can be very frustrating, and it's hard not to feel upset at times, but unfortunately that is the law and that's the way that it operates. Okay, in proving a matter beyond reasonable doubt, police may only introduce admissible evidence. And it won't surprise you to know that there's volumes and volumes written about what's admissible and what isn't. So evidence must be preserved until it is collected. The scene of a crime may need to be processed by police. So please, if something has happened and it's something serious, don't forget that we will probably want the crime scene preserved and not interfered with until we arrive and can process it. The account of events by a victim or a witness can be crucial to proving an offence. It is important that such testimony is not influenced by others. So this is a common problem that we deal with in putting cases together. We don't want witnesses all getting together and talking about their account of what occurred. Some of you may have heard of the Rashomon effect. which is a classic Japanese movie about how witnesses always give varying accounts of the same events. And that is a natural human effect, and you need to let us deal with it. You should never, as a witness, let what another witness tells you affect your account of what occurred. The best way to preserve your testimony for later use is through making a contemporaneous record of what was observed. So I used to go out and train the prison officers on how to do that, but that was back in the 80s and 90s, where we made written notes. I would imagine now you could easily record something on your phone if you wanted to, but it's your account of the event. And the sooner you make it, the more valuable your account will be in a court of criminal law. So, the next step I'll move on to probably doesn't really occur that often in a health services environment, but you will all be aware that family violence is a very topical issue in Victoria, and in fact it's actually across Australia at the moment. And many years ago now, they introduced intervention orders into the family violence environment. So one family member was able to take out a court order, a civil court order, against another family member, preventing them from doing certain things. It may be coming within the property that they live in, or approaching them and communicating with them in any way, which is a way of stopping the violence from occurring. And then a number of stalking cases became very prominent, and a number of bullying cases, and they then soon realised that they needed to actually introduce intervention orders for people who weren't family members, and they are called personal safety intervention orders. So they can be used by anybody who genuinely fears harm from another person. It's a civil process. You just need to go to a magistrate's court, and the registrar manages the process. So there does not have to be a criminal charge in existence for an intervention order to be taken out. So the only scenario that I could imagine that it would occur in a health environment would be with one of your frequent flyers who is determined that he's going to harass a particular location, and an intervention order could be applicable in those circumstances. Breaching an order, though, is a criminal offence, not a civil offence. And the orders can be extended well beyond the completion of a criminal process, so they can go on for years. Bail conditions. When somebody's charged and bailed, bail conditions can be used in a similar manner. So we can have conditions put on bail that stop somebody from doing something. If they breach a condition, they can be immediately arrested, taken back into custody and remanaged. So that's really it in a nutshell. I've put questions there, but I see we're going to have a panel. When I came in today, I was approached by a number of people who raised the issue of inconsistent responses from different police officers arriving to deal with similar incidents. So the issue here is that in the health environment we will have people doing things who are suffering from the effect of drugs, drug taking or alcohol, and it affects their ability to form mens rea, that guilty mind. So there are there's some sort of important landmarks in precedent law in relation to when somebody can and can't form a guilty mind and therefore be guilty of an offence. Probably most recently, I think it was back in the mid-80s, there was a case in Victoria called O'Connor's case, where somebody who had just taken drugs was trying to steal a car in a street, and a victim walked out and tried to stop that person who just happened to be an off-duty police officer. And the case against, he was stabbed by the offender. The offender was later apprehended, and the case against the offender was dismissed because the court came to the conclusion that he was so affected by the drugs that he couldn't form a guilty mind. But since that point in time, there's been a lot of subsequent decisions that make it much easier for us to negate that defence, O'Connor's defence, it's called. So, and that's the way the criminal law works. You'll get a landmark decision, and then you will get subsequent decisions that make the way of dealing with the issue much clearer. Now, when we get police from junior police turning up who are possibly not that experienced with conducting serious crime investigations, it's difficult for them to assess on the spot whether everything is there and that we could prove a case. So theoretically, when you report a crime to a police officer, he should take a report of that crime and actually investigate it. But a police officer also has the discretion to hear the allegation and decide there and then whether an offence has been committed or not. So what we're looking for there is to make sure that those police officers are making the right decisions at that point in time. Now, there's been recent instruction across the organisation about actually submitting briefs of evidence against people who have been affected by drugs and actually deciding further down the track whether to proceed or not. So, in most cases, I would imagine that when we're turning up to a hospital where we've had some drug-affected person go berserk and assault people, there should be a report that is submitted into our system that is then later considered for prosecution or no prosecution. It's probably wrong, and it's a big call, but it's probably wrong on most occasions to make that decision there and then on the spot. So we need to make sure that we're getting local police to do the right thing when they turn up. And I spoke to somebody and asked them to email me with details of their office location so that I could put them in touch with their local police managers so that we can get this issue rectified. But that's probably, without hearing more detail, that's probably all I can say about that at the moment.
Thank you, Mark, very much. That very thorough presentation around the police approach. Now we're going to have a panel session with Mark, Felicity and Anne Law, so we can follow the same pattern that we've had throughout the day. We can take questions from this group here, or we can take questions from our country colleagues via email. Do we have anything from the country at the moment? No? Thank you. So can I invite anyone who would like to come forward and ask a question about the presentations that you've just heard around the work that WorkSafe is doing on providing a tool for incident reporting, or best practice approaches to supporting staff following violence, or the responsibility of the police, of Victoria Police, for reporting and incident management and how you engage with them. Do you have any questions? Yes, over here. Thank you very much. Now, do we have an ability to get a microphone around, please? Or are you able to come forward and we probably need a microphone for the panel, which is there. Check that that's turned on. Thank you. If you would just like to introduce yourself before you ask your question, that would be appreciated.
My name's Sharon Wagg from Security Manager VCCC, Peter Mac. I've actually just got a couple of questions. First for Mark. I was actually just wondering about patrons in the external hospital that security may come across that may have mental health issues, and the duty of care of us as security professionals, do we call it into 000? They may not be a danger to themselves, or they may not be a danger to others. We can't determine that, but perhaps they're yelling in the street, they're dropping things, I don't know, like numerous issues.
Yeah, so the Mental Health Act actually provides the guidance here. So the police actually would probably only be interested in being called if they had a power of arrest, because otherwise they can't do anything. And that power of arrest relates to them being satisfied that the person is at risk of harm to self or others.
Right.
Due to suffering some type of mental illness. So if, and you can see it walking down the streets of Melbourne, we see people talking to themselves, and obviously with issues.
Yeah.
We need something clear to indicate that there is a risk.
Yeah.
Otherwise, and quite often you'll find if you talk to those people quite reasonably, they will do whatever you want them to do. So it's something that has to be continually assessed. So if you find somebody in the hospital, you're talking to them, still no indication that there's any real risk, then we're happy for the hospital to deal with it.
Okay, thanks.
And did you have another question?
Yeah, just one other question for Anne Law. Just there's a bit of a conflict in regards to psychological mental health, psychological first aid and incident reporting. So security professionals, when that happens to them, they have to, report that incident immediately. So they have to talk about it. We need all the details. How do we kind of counteract that conflict?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there's a very big difference between an operational debrief, if I can call it that, where you just put the facts together and a timeline together for the purposes of having an investigation conducted, or for making sure that processes are in place to prevent further problems, much like you were describing. And what happens during a structured debriefing sessions, where people are asked either individually or in a group to talk in detail about what happened, but then share their feelings about how that's affected them. And it seems to be that combination that for some people can impede their recovery. For some people, it's actually quite good for them, but unfortunately for some people, it can be harmful.
And thank you for that. Is that a practice which is still being conducted in the healthcare setting? Are you able to comment on that, Anne Lord? Are we still doing debriefs that are potentially inappropriate?
I think less and less I hear about it, but I do hear people when I run PFA workshops that it's still using the Mitchell model. Often it's modified enough that people don't have to share feelings in such a structured way. So sometimes that aspect of debriefing is removed, but you still have a CISM, often it's called, or a model that looks at, which can be fine, but there are some people that still use it, particularly individually. So some people can be referred individually for debriefing. And what's conducted in a debriefing session is where they're asked to go in detail over what happened to them and share their feeling. And that's the one that we're most worried about, actually, from the research.
Good. Thank you. Just to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, please come forward and do so. Just in the meantime, can I ask Felicity, what are the triggers for a WorkSafe investigation as opposed to an internal investigation? Are you able to explain that?
Yeah, a little. WorkSafe will sometimes decide to come out to a workplace and conduct an investigation. There are some incidents that are notifiable, and I think some of the OHS people in the room will be familiar with. You can go to our website, there's some very clear criteria about what is notifiable. WorkSafe may or may not conduct an investigation about a notifiable event. Many notifiable events we don't investigate. WorkSafe decides which events incidents we would like to investigate. It's not just notifiables. We might have someone call our advisory service, an employee or another member of the public concerned about an incident that's happened. So we might decide that we want to go and respond to that and conduct an investigation. Often in the first case, an inspector might come out and do a visit, and then they might decide to refer that for a formal WorkSafe investigation. But really, when it comes to an internal investigation, really any incidents that are reported should be investigated, and the nature of the incident should determine, you know, to what extent does that investigation take, what level of resources do you put into that investigation. Obviously, if you have a major incident, you're going to put a lot more resources into conducting that investigation. If you have what we might call a relatively minor incident, you shouldn't spend days and have a whole team working on your investigation for that, and no one has the capability to do that. But all incidents that are reported should have some level of investigation.
Thank you, Felicity. Another question over here. Thank you. Just introduce
Hi.
yourself. Thanks.
Christina Rennick from St Vincent's Hospital. It's a question about personal safety intervention orders to Mark. So at St Vincent's we've supported several staff this year to apply for PSIOs against patients and visitors after repeated threatening behaviour. And we've found that these can be a really challenging and difficult process for staff to apply for, particularly if the PSIO is challenged and they have to do multiple court appearances. The PSIO covers that single person and also those in their immediate vicinity when they're at work, but it doesn't cover everyone else in the workplace. And the threat is often directed to more than one person. And I noticed when you were talking about it, and in terms of health, you used the term, oh, something might be happening in, you know, your location. And I think that's the difference between a PSIO for a person and when it's a larger organisation. And I was wondering, do you know if there's any work happening to extend this kind of intervention order or protection for a location or an organisation rather than just a single person?
What a great question. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, so no, not that I'm aware of. So the issue here is that it would be very difficult for the civil court to say that, say, somebody can't go to a hospital. So it's very easy to say that you cannot come within 100 metres or approach or telephone nurse Smith, but you can't go to, you know, the Royal Melbourne Hospital is probably a little bit impractical.
I suppose the ones we've had where they've approached people outside of the workplace, so it's been, you know, they've caught them walking to their cars, and it could be anyone at the workplace. So it's not necessarily in the hospital, it's in their personal life, approaching people in the community, and after they've left work. So it's more than just, it could be anyone that they'd worked with. So often it could be, you know, 10 or 20 staff that were on the ward.
Who are in effect being stalked, or
could be
being stalked, or
so it is a really difficult.
So with
one.
a family violence order, you can have more than one person named as the affected family person, and with one person being nominated as the respondent. So I don't know of a personal protection intervention order where more than one person's been nominated, and so I'm not. I couldn't say whether anything's been done by the Department of Justice in that space.
It's probably another area that we need to look at as
we probably it needs to be taken on board, doesn't it? Because it's a theme that's come up a few times about at what point can you say no, enough's enough, you can't come near this organisation because of your threatening conduct to our staff. And you're trying to protect your staff as well individually from having to go through that process. Yeah, and I think perhaps that can be just taken on board from the forum, and the department might like to. Denise is nodding and Janelle's nodding, so I'm sure that will be taken on board and followed through. Okay. Other questions or comments? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Adam Blake. I'm the current unit manager of the statewide child inpatient unit. I guess a couple of comments. this forum's been fantastic to hear a lot of presentations about what's been going on to improve our reporting. I just haven't heard so much about a child perspective. So we assess and treat children under the age of 13 in an acute psychiatric setting. What I'm trying to get at is that we have engaged in trauma-informed care. We've engaged in improved restraint reduction activities. We've engaged in, we've got great collaborations with external training providers and our OC health and safety reps. That's really great. But what we're still seeing is we can't retain staff. Staff are leaving our service because of the violence. And it's a real concern for us because our senior staff are saying we just can't handle the violence anymore. And we also are seeing that our graduates, which is more concerning, that are spending the money to engage in a career, are walking in and are walking straight back out.
And are you seeing the violence escalating?
We're seeing better reporting of it, and we are seeing a greater sense of violence, yes. So, if, for example, our crisis admissions have increased threefold over the last 2 years. Yeah, so I guess that's a general comment, but I would like to ask the department, what are they trying to do to, I guess, help support retention of staff? And also, I guess even for Mark, regarding reporting children who, I guess, are assaulting our staff on a daily basis, because it is a daily basis, we engage in OVA every day. What are our options in terms of following through on reporting on children? On children,
that's a good question. So let's go to Mark with that question, and we'll leave the other question for Denise in the wrap-up. Thanks for that, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. So it's an irrebuttable presumption in law that a child under 10 cannot commit a criminal offence. So they're incapable of mens rea. So from 10 to 13, they can. It's in the children's court jurisdiction. The approach of the children's court with younger children is significantly different to that of the magistrates' court and the higher courts. So usually it's very rare for somebody 13 or younger to actually be arrested and detained. They can be charged, they can be prosecuted, but I don't think the outcomes that you would see from a children's court are really going to give your staff confidence that this issue is under control, if you get my drift.
Okay.
It's wrong to expect that the criminal courts are going to fix our social ills. It doesn't work that way. They're all about the law.
Okay. Mark, can you, the issue of, police are making judgments on the scene, if you like, about whether or not they think there is a prosecutable offence or an offence for which against which someone can be convicted. Is there any review process for those decisions? Do they get captured anywhere within the police database? And is there any process of checking their soundness?
So only if a crime report is taken. So you'll find that if, say, police are called to the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning, the first record of being called will be on the running sheet of the unit that's attending. So it's a public record. So then it's a matter for the police to decide whether they're actually going to take a crime report. If they take a crime report, then that kicks off a reviewable process.
Right.
So a supervisor automatically reviews that process. If a brief of evidence is submitted, so a brief of evidence is a bunch of documents that actually contain the evidence or the description of the evidence that will be used to prove the offence. There's much more scrutiny over a brief, and there is a review process. So quite often briefs are not authorised for prosecution, even though the informant wants to charge and prosecute. because the person reviewing the brief does not believe that the prosecution will be successful. If it is not successful, if we proceed and it is not successful, it is most likely that we will have costs awarded against Victoria Police.
Fair enough. So there's a judgment process there. And do you have any suggestions for health services where people feel that relationship's not as strong as it should be, or that they're not clear about decision making by Victoria Police? Should they be having, for example, I'm not sure if all health services have regular liaison meetings with their local management team, or any suggestions about how those relationships can be strengthened?
Yeah, so it would be with the larger health locations, so obviously the big hospitals and that, it would be very surprising if there wasn't an ongoing working relationship between the officer in charge of the local police station. But there's smaller health service locations where there wouldn't be the need to maintain those ongoing constant relationships. But if the need arises, there's no reason why that couldn't occur.
Yep.
You're quite entitled to ring the local police station to make an appointment with the local officer in charge. So every police station has an officer in charge, and discuss your issues.
Fantastic. Okay. Thanks for that. Final call for questions. Last one. Thank you.
Yeah, just on that point, when I worked in Brisbane at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, we actually had a senior sergeant who had an office in the hospital, who was based there, who could follow up on things. Is there any hope that Victoria Police are going to do anything proactive like that? It created a much better relationship. Everyone knew everyone. They were able to go along to meetings and things. It was a really, really good way of running things.
Oh, I agree. It's a very good way. So if there was something big enough, and the local divisional commander decided that it was worth that resource commitment, there's no reason why it couldn't happen. I'm not aware of it happening anywhere in Victoria at the moment, but what you're describing is really what the prison squad was. With Corrections Victoria, we had an office at Pentridge. This is when we had the prisons out at Coburg, and we would spend most of our time there. We got to know the staff. Most importantly, we got to know the prisoners that we were dealing with, so it was much easier for us to deliver timely services.
Fantastic. Okay. It's 3:30 on the end of the financial year day, Friday. So I think we might have done enough. Can you please join to thank our panel very much? Thank you to all of you. That was a really informative and helpful session. Thanks for your contribution. We're going to wrap up with a few words from Denise Ferrier from the Department of Health and Human Services, who was introduced earlier. Can I just say to you, from my perspective, it's been a real pleasure working with you today. It's obviously a serious ongoing challenge that you're all facing. I hope that today you've had some useful information and found the proceedings interesting, and I'm sure you have done, because I think all the presentations have been great. There will be an evaluation. Just have your attention just for a few minutes longer, folks. There'll be an evaluation form or an electronic evaluation link sent out to you, and we would very much ask you to evaluate the day. It'll help the department in its future planning. So thanks very much from me. Thanks to our rural and regional participants, as well as everyone in this room, and all the very best with the important work that you're all doing around keeping our healthcare system safe for the people who are delivering care. So over to you, Denise. Thank you.
And as Heather said, I'm mindfully aware that it is Friday afternoon, so I will be super quick. I just need to do a few official things, and I'll take the opportunity just to respond to two questions that were taken to the panel in that last session. One was around legal issues in terms of the personal safety intervention orders, but also in the ability of hospitals to potentially, kind of restrict access, if you like, to hospital locations for particular well-known individuals. This was an issue, as Heather said and prefaced the session, with the boards and CEOs, And the department have been and will continue to try and explore that issue with our own legal team and also government legal services. So we are trying to work our way through some of those more complex legal issues to be able to give some guidance to health services, particularly, again, executive management and boards around what is their legal obligation. Obviously, in a healthcare environment, it is tricky to, kind of refuse to treat, and that comes with its own issues in terms of being able to ask people not to attend, and when is that appropriate. So we are taking that issue up, and I just wanted to sort of reassure people that that is absolutely not something that's new to us, and we have been trying to work through that for some time, and we will continue to do it, and when we get reasonable advice that we think is helpful for services, we will provide it. The other is in relation to the sort of issues around workforce retention. Again, this is an issue that we're mindful of, and we know it's a problem, and our workforce branch within the department is an area that we work pretty closely with in terms of thinking about strategies. Again, as employers, health services also have this front of mind in terms of being able to make sure that they can put in place the right protections for staff, and being able to sort of think about recruitment and retention of their staff. So I, kind of just again, these are not issues that we're not familiar with, and are trying to work through kind of strategies to sort of, improve our ability to retain staff into our service. The official part of my job for closing is to firstly thank speakers who gave up their time today to come and present, and I would, kind of appreciate that is quite often on top of a normal job that people do, particularly people who are out in the health services who have regular jobs to do, but also for all of the speakers who presented today. So thank you. I'd like to thank Heather for facilitating the day, and she that's the second time in the last couple of weeks. Heather's done a fantastic job of an all-day forum. So thank you for that. She keeps us on track and makes sure we run to time, so it's a great sign of a facilitator. And I would also personally like to just thank my team, who are the Worker Health and Wellbeing team, who have not only put together today, but also have been working on this issue for the last 18 months or so. As a team, it is a small team. I just want to be super clear about that. It is a very small team, and we are dedicated to trying to make this kind of issue kind of easier for everyone. From a central point in terms of the department, we can only do so much, but we're endeavouring to try and produce as much information as we can. The guys have done a fantastic job of getting the website materials into at least one location to help people navigate what is quite a complex set of materials and places to actually go and find out more. I'd also just like to recognise, I see familiar faces in the crowd, and those familiar faces are people who work with us kind of, on a pretty regular basis through the sort of reference groups that we run, and also through Occ Health and Safety sort of forums. So the sector input into this work has been vital for us, and we really do appreciate that. So to my team, thank you. Enjoy your weekend. Janelle's going off on a week's holiday, so everyone who knows Janelle, please don't send her any emails. She needs a break, but so do the rest of the team. They've done a fantastic job, as I said, so thank you for that. Appreciate everyone making the time available to come. It's been, I think, a very valuable session. I hope you've taken some messages away, some learnings away, some questions away, some information that you'll go back to your services. And again, in a Victorian devolved health system, I think the key message here is network, network and network. Share and plagiarise as much as possible. You're not alone. You're not alone. We're not alone. We can't do it on our own. We need to be sharing information and learning. We need to be keeping each other informed about good practice as well as mistakes. It's not a failure, it's a learning opportunity. So if you try something, it doesn't work, let's not let someone else try it again. Let's share those learnings as well. To people who've been online all day, good job. Well done for sticking at it. Hard task being live streamed all day, so well done and thank you. Enjoy your weekend and we'll see you again. Oh, afternoon tea. There's afternoon tea outside. Thanks very much.